Okay, so on today's agenda, we're going to go over two things. Number one is the answer to P2, and then number two is essentially a head start on P3. So the purpose of P2 is to essentially create an API that you can interact with. The purpose of which is to keep track of users. That those are stored in a global array right over here. And for each route, you're supposed to basically access this and then add stuff to it, filter stuff out. Basically just a bunch of standard operations. So we had to implement a bunch of routes, the first one of which is partially already done for you. So this is the main route. How it works is in app.js, you have a user router, which points to the file that you guys work in. And then that stuff points to /users. So whenever you hypothetically send a request that is pointed to localhost /user, users plural, you will basically be calling the routes that you define in this file right over here. So with that, if I were to hypothetically run this, and then send a GET request with nothing in it, you'll basically get an empty array back because that is what the users array is defined as. If I put an object in this, for example, and then run the same command and send the same request, you will basically see it pop up over here as well. So that's like the main one that's already been provided for you. What you were supposed to do with this is implement some additional search query functionality. So the way you would do that is essentially access the request.query variable. So if you just do this, if I print this to console, for example, you'll see that if I were to hypothetically send a request then in the backend you'll see this object. So for the search parameter, you would basically isolate this variable and then perform two things. So if search does exist, right, then you would have to filter out the users based on certain parameters. And if there is no search parameter query, then you just send the rest, or send all the users that you currently have in storage, for example, this. Okay, so the way we would do this is to essentially, can someone remind me, we were supposed to search for everything that is in the name and bio, is that correct? Okay. So what we do is essentially we call a dot filter on the users array, and what this does, it returns a new copy with all of the elements inside of it that fulfill a certain requirement. So in this case, our requirement is the fact that it includes search, right, our content in that variable, or if the bio has that same content inside of it. So if I run this real quick, and then just for example, we have two users in our array. These don't follow the schema just yet, but we'll figure that out in a bit. If I want to search for something with hello, then you'll get this user. And if you just want to get all the users, then you can remove the search query, and you'll get both. If I want to search for the other user, then you can just change the query, and then you get your result. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's that. Let me just confirm that. Yeah, that's pretty much the whole thing. Okay. We also had to implement a post request, and with that, we had to validate the user schema. So our user is supposed to be in a specific format that includes name, bio, and username, I believe. Yeah. So since we'll be using this, since we'll be validating the user schema for multiple routes, so I think post and put, we can just put this in a separate function or method. All right, so what I did just here is essentially, this is purely for syntax. I just want to isolate the name, username, and bio from the user object. And then if any of these are undefined, then this whole thing returns false, right? Because when you try to put undefined into, or like an empty string into like an if statement, it automatically converts to false. So if either of these are undefined, then it's false. And then you just check if they're all strings. This isn't that big of a deal if you didn't do it. Like, don't like kill yourself over it. And then we also have this thing where the body had to match the schema exactly. So if it has the username, name, and bio, but it has some other field, then that's technically a violation, even though you do have the 3 fields that are technically required. So we just check for that as well. Again, not that big of a deal if you didn't do it. But what we can do is essentially use this for our further requests, for example, with post. With this, we isolate, or not isolate, but like we access the user body through request.body, right? So okay, should we just call our function, and then if it doesn't pass our validation check, then we just return status of 404 and then send any error message that you want. If it does validate if the user schema is validated, then you basically go to the next line and then perform all of your further checks and modifications. So correct me if I'm wrong, the only check that you have to do is basically check if the username is available. Is that correct, or is there something else that you should do? You don't think so? Okay, so the way you do that is essentially you have to try to see if the username is available, right? So the way you do that is you try to find the user with that username that you are currently trying to access, right? So the way you do that is through something like this. So what this does is you call the .find method on users, the array, and then you pass the condition that for each user you want to check if the username matches what you currently want to add. So if the user's array doesn't have anything with this username, then it's not like, I lost my train of thought. But if it doesn't have anything, then found user is going to be undefined, and then you can use that to check if it's available or not. So technically, if found user is undefined, that means there's no user that exists with that field, which means that you can actually go ahead and push it to the user's array. So but if found user is defined, then that means you can't really do anything about it. So you have to return an error. So here we return the error if found user is defined. So that means if there's already an existing user. If there is no existing user, then we just automatically skip to the next line, and we can go ahead and push our body that we sent. So far to run this. And then in Postman, one thing that you have to make sure is an actual thing is when you send the request, your headers should contain a content type of application/JSON, which seems to be missing here, so I'm just going to add that real quick. And then in our body, we just pass the stuff that we want to add. So once I run this request, you can see that we have our 2 existing users that we hard-coded into our initial program, which we can remove later, and then our new user that we just added. If I want to add this again, then you get an error that the username is conflicting. If I add another field, then you get an error that it's not following the user schema. And then if I take away a field, then you get the same error. Oops. Okay, does that make sense? So that's it for the post request. All right, for put, it's a little bit more involved, but it follows the same principle. So you are supposed to accept a parameter that follows this format. So essentially, you are looking for a username to edit in your URL. And the way you do that is through rec.params.username. So what we would try to do here is edit one of our existing username users. Excuse me. Let's say the so you would send a put request with localhost/user/dummy. Okay, if you have a user that you want to edit that has a username of dummy. So with this in mind, we put this into a variable. We want to see if the user that we want to edit exists, right? If that person doesn't exist, then you want to add it into the array. So we can push this out. Okay, so if the user doesn't exist, then we want to create it, right? If the user does exist, then you want to edit it with the new information that you put in the body. However, in the functionality to edit a user, you have the opportunity to change the username, right? But what if you want to change the username of one of your users to another name that already exists in your array? You shouldn't be able to allow that, right? So if you have a username of A and a username of B, and you want to change A to B, you shouldn't be able to do that because then you would have two Bs, and then all of the uniqueness of the username just kind of goes away. So we want to essentially check if, first of all, check if you want to change the username. And so first of all, I want to check that. So all right, so this becomes a Boolean. And then if you are changing the username, so what you do here is in your users array, you try to find a user that has the same username that you are trying to change your existing one to. So if this is undefined, that means the username that the new username that you're trying to set is available, which means you can go ahead and change all that. So essentially, if we don't have a username conflict, then we can go ahead and change all of that info. And then because editing user is technically a reference to the object in the array, what you can do is essentially access each individual element, so .username, .name, and .bio, and then set it to whatever value, and then those values will be reflected in the original user's array. So if I run my code, and then try to change username dummy to some other thing. Let's see if this works. Okay, so we just did that. We converted the user that was initially this object right here with dummy test and hello to this object right here, which is on axis. Okay, if I want to restart this code and then give another example. So let's say I want to change dummy to a username that already exists. So in this case, it's going to be test2. So this should return an error, which it doesn't. All right, because we're using test2 for the name, not the username. Let me just fix that real quick. So now we get an error with conflicting username. Okay. So in this case, we have more checks than the post request, but the overall premise is the same. You just make sure that there is no conflict, and then if there is no conflict, then you can either edit the user that already exists or create a new one if the user doesn't exist. Does anyone have any questions? Okay. What other routes are we supposed to implement? So with delete, you do the same thing with regards to finding a username to delete. There is no body involved in this case, so you don't have to validate a user schema. And you want to find the user that you want to delete. So all right, so if found user is undefined, or rather, we can use find index because that'll help us later. If the index is -1, that means that there is no user that you want to delete in the users array. So if this is true, that means that there is no user, right? Which means that we want to return an error. So otherwise, we can just splice or slice, we'll figure this out later, that element from the array. So if I do users splice, I'm going to put documentation for that. Yep, so it's going to be this one. We want to put in the index, and then we want to put in the fact that we want to delete only one user. So what it does is you have an array of like 10 users. You start at the index of like 5, and then the second number basically tells you, starting from 5, how many do you want to remove from the array? Okay. So we just do that. We want to delete one user, and then we want to return our array. So if I run this real quick, then I want to delete the user with username dummy. Hold up. Whoops. So if I run this, then in my users array, there is no more user with the name of dummy. And that is the entire backend of your P2. And then the front end is basically just sending fetch requests to your API. So basically, instead of this console, let's see if I can get this to work. Okay. So basically just replace our console statements with a request that looks something like this. And this is just very straightforward. We do this for everything except maybe, for example, for read, we just want to remove this. And then for delete, so here we read our users. Here we create a user, right? Let's say we want to update dummy to dummy2, which press this button, and it doesn't work. All right, so in this first one we have dummy, and then in the second one we have dummy2. So it's the same user. And then if we want to destroy dummy2, then we can just click this button, and then you see that dummy2 is now gone. So that is the entirety of your front-end testing. If you want, you could have added more buttons that do different things, but this is just like the basics. In your video demonstration, you should have used, this as well as Postman for your testing, and then also gone over your code. Any questions for P2? So we can get started on P3. Okay. So we have 24 minutes until we get kicked out of this room. Long story short, the purpose of P3 is the same thing as P2, but instead of manipulating users in a global array that's in your code, you can just actually interact with a database that is either somewhere on your computer or somewhere in the cloud, so that information actually persists, and then you can have the API restart or shut off or whatever without losing the data that you added previously. So in P2, like whenever we would restart a database, we would basically start with an empty users array, unless we manually added stuff to the code so that it appears every single time, which we don't want. So in industry, you definitely want persistence of data, and that's what we're gonna be doing in P3. So if you want to know, I'm not gonna go over how to install the database on your machine or how to get one set up and running anyway. That's gonna be up to you. But personally, I would recommend following these instructions to create a free account on MongoDB Atlas. It's basically just a free MongoDB database in the cloud. It's a good starting point, and then because it's free, you can use it for any other personal projects that you might want to work on, or maybe even for your final project. That would be pretty useful too. Also, because it's in the cloud, it has the added benefit of you being able to interact with it from pretty much anywhere. Instead of, if it's running locally on your PC, then at the end of the day, it's still on your PC, and then you would have to open it up, go through a bunch of network settings to try to make it accessible elsewhere. So we don't want that. So my personal recommendation, just create an account on MongoDB Atlas. It'll work out for you a lot better than installing it locally. Okay, but I'm not going to go over how to do that. If you want to do it, the instructions are right here. I personally updated them to make sure that like you can follow them step by step with the newest UI stuff. So hopefully you won't run into any confusion. If you do, just email me, but do try to figure it out because the user interface is pretty self-explanatory. If I open it up over here somewhere, then once you create your stuff, this is most likely what you'll see coming into the dashboard. If you want to see the data that you are currently working with for your project, you can just click on this arrow. That'll open up the menu, and then you can go to the cluster, collections, and then all your stuff will be here. Okay. So for purposes of this demonstration, I'm just gonna delete this real quick. So now we're starting with a clean slate. Okay, just like you will when you're starting P3. So with this in mind, you will be working in film.js in the routes, and then film.js in models. So at the moment, you are given a very basic schema just to get you started with the library. Make sure that you install all the dependencies that are outlined in npm install. These scripts are outdated. You can just do node app. You can replace this with node app, and you don't need this either way. But you can, like, if you want to do npm start, you could. But personally, this just seems easier. That's up to you. Doesn't matter. So if I were to run this code, which I am right now, it's the same premise as in P2, where we have our film.js route. It is right over here as a router, and it is connected to /films. So instead of using Postman to send stuff to /users, it'll look like this. Okay. So at the moment, if I press send over here, then I get absolutely nothing. That is because, I get an empty array, simply due to the fact that our route tries to find something in our database, but there's nothing there. Okay. If I run a post command, post request, what this will do is, with our stuff defined in film.js with a capital F, we export it, okay, and then it is imported right over here. So that's how we access it. So you do film.create, which is an official method. If you ever want to find out how to use functions in Mongoose, you go on the official documentation, and this will have all the stuff that you need to complete this assignment. Okay. So if we do the post route, then it'll create our example film, and then we'll be able to see that in our database. So at the moment, we have nothing. But if I send a request that is of type post, then it'll, well, first things first, it'll auto-generate an ID that is unique to this object. And then, I don't know what this is, I forgot. But if I were to refresh my data, which is this button right over here, then you see that it creates a database, it creates a collection in that database, and then I see my stuff over here. And then even if I were to hypothetically restart the server, once I run the GET request, the information that I added still persists. So that's where the beauty comes in. That means you can basically add a bunch of stuff, and it'll stay there when you restart the server. So if you look at the README for our assignment, you're supposed to implement a bunch of routes. I'm not going to do each one, but I'm just going to go over the basics of how you can interact with Mongoose to create and basically query data. So it's just a great starting point, and then you can use that to familiarize yourself with the syntax, and then actually look further into the Mongoose documentation to hopefully get this done on your own. But we have a post, so this should accept the JSON just like in P2, and create a new film element just like we did just now. However, instead of just having a title, it should follow a specific schema, which is outlined right over here. So you have film ID, title, body, and date. If you didn't notice, our stuff already comes with an ID. It's supposed to be that way. However, for the purposes of this assignment, you will be adding another field to it, such that the server actually decides what ID to assign it. So it's going to be like a number of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on and so forth. And then puts that additional field with the rest. So you'll have this auto-generated one by MongoDB, and then you'll also have a number. And I'll go into the basics of this in a minute. So let's say I don't like the concept of film. Let me just go with cat. Okay, so I just switched stuff from film to cat for the purposes of not exactly giving you the answer. So the first thing that you should do is update the schema to match the one outlined in the README. For purposes of this demonstration, I'm not going to do that, but I'm going to do something similar, where you have a cat ID, which is a number, and then let's say a name, and then date, just like in your assignment. And then it should also have, let's say, children, just like you have reviews. We have a cat schema, and then we should also have a kitten schema. Actually, let's go instead of children, we just do kittens. Where it also has a kitten ID, and then a name and a date. Whoops. Okay, so this is what our schema looks like. What this ends up looking like in the database is you have your cat object with a cat ID, name, date, and then kittens will be an array with however many of these objects you want inside of it. Okay. So with that in mind, let's see if I can. Let's create a couple of examples. We're just going to create 3 examples for this demonstration. 3 cats, IDs of 1, 2, and 3, and Billy, Billy 2, Billy, Billy 3. So if I run this real quick, then I will get nothing. But if I do post, then I'll get 1 result because that's what I return. But if I run get again, then you see that I have all this information. So kittens is an array. We have our date. The name is Billy, cat ID of 1. What you should never do is expose this ID to the responses, like in the responses. So you should definitely hide this. The way you do that is up to you. What you can do is, since you know the structure of the stuff that you create, for example, you can do docs.map cat, and then you can just use map, and that'll isolate the sensitive ID. So if you see that you are returning like this in your API response, then we might take a couple of points off because that's technically security issue in industry. Okay. So if I rerun this, then hopefully this will work. Whoops. Okay, so we basically filter out all the stuff that we don't need, and in our response we have just the good stuff. So that's how you query big, like on a big level, right? So let's say we want to update one of the cats to have kittens. So we don't need this anymore. So in this example, we find a cat with an ID of 3. Okay. we can access the kitten's element from that, push a new kitten into the array, and then save the result in the database, and then we can return that result. So if I were to hypothetically do this, let me just refresh this. We have our 3 cats, no kittens just yet, but if I were to run our post request, then we get this result. And then if I refresh this again, then you see that we have an object in our array. So now we have kitten. So that's how you add reviews to your film, for example. Okay. And then if you want to update stuff, then you can use, let's see. You can use find one and update. One thing that I want to cover before we run out of time is how to do some of the text-based queries that you are supposed to do later on in the assignment, just to get it out of the way. So when you define your schema, you have the opportunity to create some query helpers. Okay, so that is another parameter in this one big mongoose.schema function. Okay, you can pass stuff into it, and the way you would do that is there's a query field that you can sort of manipulate and add stuff to. Now, let's say you want to search a cat based on stuff that it has in its name, for example. Okay, so you would define the function, and then you can return basically like this, which points to like the model, right? Dot where, which runs a query on the database, and then pass stuff into it. So we only have one name here, but in your assignment you want to like search for stuff that's like the title or like the body, right? So you would have to use multiple parameters. So you would use OR with that, since you want to basically include all results in the database that contain a certain search query in either the title or the body, right? In this case, we just have the name, but you get the point. I can just add a different parameter later on. So let's say the name instead of just cat. Right, and then if you want multiple parameters, then what you can do is turn this into an array and then add more stuff to it. Like if you wanted to hypothetically check if the cat ID would also match this, then you would do this as well. But this would low-key kind of break it because search would be a string and card ID is a number, but you get the point. So we just have something like this, and then if I go back to my code and look for, instead of something like this, we can do find one dot, or actually find, since you want to return all results that contain this. And then what this does is essentially give you access to this function in your find function, right? Like as a component of that, and then you can pass whatever into it. So, for example, if I want to do Billy, then this will give me the result where this is equal. However, if I want to return all results where that stuff is included, then I can do, instead of this object over here, or instead of search, I can just do new regular expression, search, and then pass the I option into it as well. So if I run this, hopefully this works, and then do get, then I'll get all results where there's Billy in the name. If I want to change this to, instead of Billy, where it's just 3, right, because we only have one cat that has 3 in the name. Please work. Okay. And I run this. Damn it. Okay, it didn't work. I will build a Piazza post with this example. So you'll see this in the recording, and then you'll see a working version of this in Piazza as well. So hopefully this will help you basically get started on P3. And then once you're comfortable with this, then you'll be comfortable, hopefully, with the rest of the stuff, and you can sort of start looking at the documentation and actually building the routes just like you did in P2, but instead of updating the users array, you would update the database. Does that sound good? All right, thank you.